And we're going to begin with Professor Bob White, who is, as I say, Associate Director of the Faraday Institute. He's Professor of Geophysics in the university and a Fellow of the Royal Society. So his interests are in volcanoes and earthquakes and things of that kind. He's also director of the John Ray Initiative, which works to develop and communicate a Christian understanding of the environment. And he's been a fellow of this college since 1988. Hand over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much. Well, I'll add my welcome to you. Thank you very much for coming. I can see your church people because you've started sitting at the back first. What I would like to do in the next 50 minutes or so is talk about some general introductions. You're going to have much more theological input from the other speakers through the rest of the course. But I thought I'd give you some of the scientific background as well as some of the basic principles of theology that we might use. I'm going to focus in this talk mostly on climate change, global climate change, as an example of environmental issues. And I think it's a good one to focus on because it is a global problem and it requires global solutions. So actually it's one where Christians not only should take the lead, I think, because we believe in a creator God, so we certainly ought to care for the creation, but also one where it might actually bring together people of different faiths and different cultures and different beliefs globally. So in that respect, it's quite an important one. So David King, who until recently was the government's chief scientific advisor, described climate change as a bigger threat than terrorism. Well, that's quite a claim, isn't it, in this day and age where the news is dominated by terrorism. So it is a big issue, I think, even though it sort of creeps up on you. And one of the striking things that happened in the last year or so, there was this book published by E.O. Wilson, who is an American from Harvard, and he is a professor of ecology, invented ecology more or less, probably one of the most eminent living biologists in the world at the moment. And he's president of the Secular Humanist Society in North America, an avowed atheist. And he wrote this book, which is a book to a mythical Southern Baptist pastor. It's written in a North American context. And basically his argument is, look, you guys who are Christians say that you believe in a creator God, so surely you ought to care for the creation. I'm a scientist and I love the creation and I want to see care for the creation. Why don't we actually get together because we've got common interests? Now, I thought that was very striking that an atheist should be haranguing the Christians to do something about this. He goes on to say, look, there's a few 10,000s of us, secular humanists in North America, and there's tens of millions of you guys, so you could really make an impact if you wanted to. And I think perhaps the message I want to leave today is that if we do believe in a creator God, then certainly we ought to care for creation, therefore. And if we don't, we're actually denying something of our faith, and we're certainly not being very good role models to those around us. So, as I said, this is the sort of outline that I want to pursue today. I want to talk, first of all, about some of the scientific issues about global climate change, then some theological and ethical issues, and just a brief run through some practical stuff at the end. And a lot of this will be developed later in the course, so it really is just a starter. It's hard to stand here, I guess, when it's been so blooming cold and say that there is global warming going on. And actually, this is one of the issues that the public at large, especially the sceptics, don't understand really, or don't accept that climate goes up and down on a not only a daily and monthly basis, but on an annual and even longer than that basis. And so it's very easy for people to say, oh, I don't believe in global warming, it's been so cold, how can you believe in that? Well, the answer to that is that actually some areas will get colder, and Britain is one of the ones, if global climate change carries on as it is now and the North Atlantic Drift, which we commonly call the Gulf Stream, closes down, it will get very, very cold here. At 52 North, where we are now, if you go across to Canada, you'll find it's extremely cold at the moment, and Siberia likewise. There will certainly also be big changes in the extremities of weather, so there'll be more storms and more droughts, for example. And Britain, I think, is predicted probably to get much wetter and colder if climate change carried on. So just the simplistic view of where I live, it's got colder, so I don't believe global climate change is not a valid answer, because globally the world is getting hotter, and as I say, 11 of the last 12 years have been the hottest on record. 98 was the warmest year on record globally ever in the history of humankind. There's the longest continuous temperature record that exists in the world is in Britain, actually. We've been measuring temperature continuously on a daily basis for 390 years, and 2006 was the hottest year on record, if you can cast your mind back that far. And one of the key things, actually, is that the rate of change of temperature is higher than it's ever been before. And I'll show you some graphs to show that in a minute. And that's important because humans can't adapt to changes in our current culture and societies, as they may have done in the past. In the past, if you're a hunter-gatherer and it gets a bit hotter, you just go north a little bit to get back to the sort of area where the temperature suits you. Nowadays, we fight wars over boundaries, over national boundaries. So you can't just move somewhere else. You become a refugee if your country has suffered drought or if it's got flooded, so you can't live on it anymore, or inundated by seawater if you live in a deltaic area, so you can't grow crops. And so I think actually the biggest pressing problem that we will see from climate change is an influx of refugees around the world. And I have to say that our record of welcoming strangers into our country is not great. So I think that will be the main presenting issue. So there's been 0.7 degrees C rise in global temperature during the 20th century. And at this point you might say, well, why does less than 1 degree matter? Well, it matters because the difference between an ice age and a temperate period, like we're in now, is only about 5 degrees. So we're already getting to 20% of that. And also we are in an interglacial now. We're in a hot period. So this is taking us even hotter. And it's outside the range of temperature that humans, since they've existed on this Earth for the last 150,000 years, have ever experienced. So we're going into uncharted territory. So if we plot the Earth's temperature, say, for the last 1,000 years, from 1000 AD to the present day, this is what the temperature's done. It's gone up and down a bit from year to year. There's a volcano or something, which makes it colder because there's a lot of ash, and there's El Niño and El Niña. But look what's happened since the Industrial Revolution. It's shot up, and this is that 0.7 degrees or so that I was talking about. And that rate of change of climbing is very, very rapid. That's the problem. Now, when you look at the last 150 years, say, in more detail, what you find is that actually it's gone up, it's gone down, it's gone up again. And this is a point at which people that want to deny climate change, and most commonly they want to deny it because they've got a nice lifestyle and they like their big limousines and they like holidays abroad and they like all the other trappings of materialism that come with a Western capitalist lifestyle. They say, well, it's just natural variation. Look, the biggest period of industrialisation post-Second World War, actually the temperature dropped. So how can you say that greenhouse gases caused by industrialisation cause climate change? Now, there is, like many of these arguments, there are very simple answers to that. And the simple answer, actually, is that all that heavy industrialisation put an awful lot of dirt into the air, soot particularly, and if you layer the upper atmosphere with soot, you actually reflect a lot of sunlight and you get global cooling. I guess many of us are old enough to remember the scares about nuclear winters. If there was a nuclear exchange, it'd throw so much debris into the atmosphere that it would get very cold. There'd be a nuclear winter following it. And what actually happened during the 60s, 70s was a lot of Clean Air Acts to clean up the air. You couldn't burn coal in central London anymore, for example. And that was true across Europe and North America. And actually, when we started removing a lot of that pollution by Clean Air Acts, then the underlying trend came out even more clearly of global temperature increase because we're increasing greenhouse gases. So that dip there can be understood largely, again, by human influence, human effects. There's more sort of anecdotal evidence, as you can go and look at what glaciers are doing, for example. This is a glacier in Argentina, which is retreating. This was a picture taken in 1928, and people have gone back to, as near as they can find it, the exact same place, and taken another photograph at the present day. So look at this photo taken in 2004 from the same place. That ice has melted. Now, ice takes a long time to melt. So this is responding quite sluggishly to climate change, and that's quite scary. Here's another example from Europe, from Austria. This glacier, 1875, go back beginning of the 21st century, and the ice has just completely gone. So this is sort of anecdotal evidence, if you like, of climate change. Well, this is an experiment. I just want to see how awake you are this morning. I know it's Monday morning, quite early, but this is a little test for you. This is one of the sort of poster boy pictures for climate change. Now, as far as we know, actually no polar bears have ever died because of the Arctic melting, but nevertheless it's become a sort of symbol of climate change. This is a test. Let me ask you, just if you thought of one photo that brought back an image of Vietnam War, what would you think of? Quickly. What's come to your mind quickly?
Kid in the street.
Is it this one?
On the street, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Kim Phuc, 8th of June 1970. I've tried this dozens of times and it's always the same answer that people give. And it's an answer certainly that the US government would not like at all, because this, in fact, was a case of friendly fire. It was the case of the South Vietnamese bombing, of the Americans bombing a South Vietnamese village. That's why there's American GIs in the background evacuating the village. They napalmed it. Kim Phuc now lives in the USA. Actually, she's a mother and has written books about it. But images can become extremely powerful, because that's the one that everybody remembers about the Vietnam War. And I suspect that this, even if it's not strictly factually true, that at the moment polar bears are suffering, is the one that people remember as an image of climate change. Well, some people ask whether humanity is responsible for global warming. Isn't it just the normal cycle? I've already said, for one thing, the rate of change is faster than we've ever seen before. This is one answer, actually. This is a thermal imaging view of the Houses of Parliament. Red is hot and blue is cold. This picture was shown in the Times as proof that the Houses of Parliament are full of hot air. So there's one answer. Here's a slightly more scientific answer. If you take many, many climate models and you use them to predict what the temperature ought to be over the past 100 years, in this case, you get a range of answers in blue here. And this has put in all the natural forcings, they're called, all the natural phenomena like volcanic eruptions, which tend to put a lot of sulfur dioxide and dirt in the air, which lowers temperature. El Nino and El Niño, which increase and decrease temperature globally. Put them all in and you get that sort of variation over the past 100 years. Now, if you plot what the temperature has actually done by just looking and measuring it, it does this black dotted line. And it diverges. It fits all right for the first 50 years. The last 50 years, it's diverging desperately. But now if you put into the models the greenhouse gases that humans have created, mostly by burning fossil fuels, so oil and coal and gas, you get these pink range of models. And again, it fits quite well. Well, that's one indication that humans are responsible. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is a very authoritative group of thousands of scientists from all the nations of the world, essentially, come together and have a consensus report. It was published last year, the most recent one. If you like, it's the lowest common denominator, because everybody, including the Americans, who are often opposed to some aspects of climate change, agree on. They have said that the fact of temperature change, of global climate change, is unequivocal in their most recent report. Well, unequivocal is as strong a word as you can get. They're very, very careful with their statistics. They said the likelihood that humans have caused it is very likely. Very likely means more than 90% certain. And if I said it's very likely you'll get knocked over by a bus if you walk outside of St Edmunds College gates after coffee this morning, you wouldn't do it, would you? Because the 90% probability is extremely high. Most scientists think it's pretty well certain that humans have caused it. And even if they haven't, we ought to take precautions, because this is happening anyway, so we can do something about it. Well, what causes global warming? The thing you always hear about is carbon dioxide, and indeed that is one of the most potent gases. That's responsible for about 2/3 of the warming. Interestingly, methane is responsible for a quarter of the warming, even though the amount of methane is very, very much smaller than carbon dioxide, and that's because it's a much more potent greenhouse gas. It has about 20 times the effect of carbon dioxide. And some of these other things I've listed, nitrous oxide and other things, are even more potent. like thousands of times more potent. So you only need a little bit of them, and they have a big effect. But carbon dioxide is still the biggest one. Water vapour is important as well, and there are feedbacks between them. And in fact, perhaps something people don't realise is that actually natural greenhouse warming is quite a good thing. There is naturally carbon dioxide, water vapour in the atmosphere, and it warms up the Earth by about 30 degrees. So if it weren't for them, the Earth would be about minus 20 degrees centigrade, and life would not be possible. The average temperature of the Earth is about 15 or so, and that's because of natural greenhouse warming. So greenhouse warming is not a bad thing of itself. What's bad now is the rate of change of what humans are doing by pumping these gases into the atmosphere. And it will take about 100 years to get the carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere if we stopped emitting any right now. So what we've done already will affect the future and will affect our children and grandchildren. Now, when I was working on this, there's some funny statistics about methane, for example, that it turns out there are 18 billion cows in the world, and they produce a lot of methane, actually, from both ends, about 500 litres a day. And it turns out that the greenhouse warming from cows is about 18% of the total greenhouse warming in the world, which is more than all the transport in the whole world put together. So it's more than all the cars and buses and trains and airplanes put together, is cows. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because an increase in meat eating is a very recent phenomenon. One of the things that happens in a developing country if you get rich is you buy a Mercedes and you eat more meat. You eat 3 meat meals a day. We eat a lot of meat here. And certainly this statistic has led my wife and I not to become vegetarian, but to eat much more vegetarian meals more commonly. Because eating a lot of meat is, actually it's not very good for you either if it's red meat, if you eat too much. But each kilogram of meat takes about 10 kilograms of vegetable protein to grow. And of course there's also other side effects, like a lot of forest is cleared to make pasture in South America for cows. So overindulgence in meat is part of the impact which is causing global climate change. Now, some of you might have seen yesterday in the Sunday Times, I saw this statistic that every Google search you do uses energy, of course, in the electricity it uses. And if you take all the electricity of all the computers in the world and all the Google searches, that accounts for about 2% of greenhouse gas production, just Google searches, which is equivalent to all the greenhouse gas production from all the airplane flights in the world. Now, I say that not to say that you shouldn't do Google searches, but just to make the point that, you know, living in the world has an impact on other people, whatever it is we do. And I think that's a helpful thing to remember. Well, let's go back to some of the statistics. This is what the temperature has done over the past 160,000 years, which is the whole period that Homo sapiens has been on Earth. It's gone up and down by 5 or 6 degrees. And this is the last 2 ice ages. This is the last ice age, and this is the last temperate period, which was 130,000 years ago, and the most recent one, which ended about 10,000 years ago. Now, it's no mistake, I think, that human development culture, since the Neolithic on, has been during this one period when climate was very, very stable, in an interglacial period just here. And what we're doing now is taking us out of that. Now, if you plot carbon dioxide, which I said is one of the most potent one of the most important greenhouse gases, over that same period, it's done exactly the same thing. It goes up when temperature goes up, down when temperature goes down. Now, the cause of these ice ages is well understood. It's due to orbital variations between the Sun and the Earth, which have this sort of periodicity. But what we're doing now, I haven't put on the last 50 years on here, but if I put that on now for what we were doing with carbon dioxide, that's what we're doing now. We've gone up to, I think it's 386 parts per million now. We're heading for double, and the government is talking about limiting greenhouse gas emissions to double what they were pre-industrial times, which is up here. If we carry on as we are now, it'll go up to here. And you can just see that if that much change makes that much temperature change, I mean, you can tell how much it's going to be a massive change to temperature by increasing this much carbon dioxide this quickly into the atmosphere. We can go back further. It turns out that if you take an ice core through an ice cap like Greenland or the Antarctic, you can actually see annual layering from snowfall, and you get little bubbles trapped in the ice, so you can measure the carbon dioxide level, and you can work out what the temperature was from, technically you look at oxygen isotope ratios, because they're sensitive to temperature. So what I've plotted here is the last 400,000 years from an ice core in Antarctica, carbon dioxide, methane, and the temperature at the bottom. And you can see that they're all correlated. One goes up, another goes up. So this is the last 1, 2, 3, 4 ice ages, the most recent one ending 10,000 years ago. And if I again put what we've done in the last 100 years, carbon dioxide's gone up, as I showed you just now. Methane has gone up even further compared to what it was at any time during the history of humankind. And so what is temperature going to do? That is the question. Now, there are complex feedbacks between these, but there's no doubt that it's going to go up a lot. And this is what happens if you get runaway global warming. Venus was just like Earth. It's not very much different in its orbit around the Sun. It's about 86% of the distance from the Sun that we are. It's about the same size, just slightly smaller. But there's been runaway greenhouse heating on Venus. So the carbon dioxide level is 96% of the atmosphere, and the surface temperature is about 450 degrees C hotter than it would otherwise be because of that greenhouse warming. Earth, we're 0.04% carbon dioxide at the moment. Surface temperature is 15 degrees C. Now, I'm not saying this because I expect this to happen, but this is at least one example of what has happened when there's been runaway greenhouse warming. An issue that I should just mention, although I don't want to go into it, is that in any detail, is that global population is one of the main drivers of production of greenhouse gases, of course, because if you have twice as many people living at the same standard of living, you'll make twice as much greenhouse gas. And it's very interesting to plot global population from, say, the sort of time that we might think Adam and Eve were around, 10,000 years BC to the present day, because nothing much changed for a long time until the last few centuries. In fact, the last few decades, actually. So actually now there are 3 times as many people alive as there were when I was born. 3 times as many people. There's 6 billion people in this world. Now, predictions are that it won't just keep on climbing forever, because clearly it can't. But also as people get better healthcare, better education, and to some extent more wealth, the birth rate drops. So it's estimated that maybe the global population will stabilise at about double what it is now, maybe 10 or 11 billion people, 1,000 million people. But there is no doubt that this is a factor, an important factor, in all the issues about the environment that we'll be talking about these next couple of days. Because more people obviously put more load on the environment. And if they all lived like we live in Europe, you'd actually need 3 whole planet, 3.5 planet Earths to support everybody in our standard of living. So we're already talking about a moral issue, because we're going to say if we want to live like we're living now and there's this many people, we're using so much of the resources that the other lot, which mostly are out of sight in the southern hemisphere or Asia, will have to live at a much, much, much lower standard of living if we are going to support them sustainably on this Earth. Well, this is a prediction of what carbon dioxide will do if we carry on as we are. We're 2000, and this is the end of this century. We're right down here now, so it will quadruple. It tails off much with the same shape as global population is thought to be expected to do. If we try reducing our use, and I must say I'm pessimistic about this because we say the words in our country, but we don't do much about it, then maybe we can limit the increase of fossil fuels so that we just double what we're producing now by the end of the century. If we try really, really, really hard to wean ourselves off fossil fuels particularly, we might reduce back to the level we were at in 1990, say, by the second half of this century, this blue curve. Now, the next curve, the next graph, shows these same 3 plots, these same 3 colours, but in temperature. So if we don't do anything, temperature is going to increase 5 degrees or so. If we try, just in a British sort of way, just to decrease our use a little bit, it'll still go up to 3 degrees above now. And most people think that 2 degrees is an important cut-off where there'll be major disruption in the world because of droughts and so on. If we stop producing greenhouse gases essentially straight away, temperature will still go up for the next 100 years. And that's because it takes 100 years to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So this is the imperative for acting now, because we've already done a lot of what's going to happen. And I think this is the thing that it's really hard to get across to people, that you've already committed the world to these changes. Now, what are some of the effects of global warming? Well, as I said earlier, one of the big effects is more extreme events. So more floods, more droughts. We see a little bit of this. It's very hard to know they're exactly due to global climate change, but everybody expects this to be the case. And it turns out that actually earthquakes and volcanoes aren't really the most dangerous things on this world. It's actually floods are what kill people, just something very sort of down to earth in a way. And I mean, we even saw, didn't we, last year in Gloucestershire, floods killing, how many people was it? Several people at the end of the year. Now, many of us are old enough to remember the 13th of November 1970, I guess, in this room. I guess what many of us don't remember, because it was somewhere a long way away, was that on that day, on the 30th of November 1970, more than 500,000 people died in Bangladesh from flooding. Very mundane, if you like. But if you live somewhere like this, you know, flooding destroys your home, your livelihood, and it might well drown you as well. I mean, more recently, just last year, do you remember Burma, the floods there? This is a satellite photo of the Irrawaddy Delta before those storms, and this is a picture from satellites of the same delta. If I just flick back and forth and you look in the deltaic region here, you can see how much is now covered by water. That region was flooded. Now, in a way, that's not unexpected, but people in this case suffered enormously because of, you remember the junta in power would not allow aid to go in. There was aid waiting to go in, and they wouldn't allow it in. And that, of course, the aid wouldn't have stopped any initial drowning, but it would have helped with the aftermath. And it's been estimated that 134,000 people died, and that there are still now 1 million people homeless. So here's another case where, removed maybe, it's a change due to global climate change, but it's affecting people somewhere else. Floods are not uncommon. In 1887, 1 to 2 million people died in China. And actually China, a lot of people have died. 31 there were floods that killed maybe up to nearly 4 million people. And in the 20th century, the century just gone, floods affected about 100 million people a year. That's a lot of people. But because people live in river valleys, you know, where there's water, and they live by the coast where there's communication, it's estimated that by 2025, which isn't very far away now, half the world's population will be at risk from storms. And storms, increased storms, are one of the main likely outcomes of global climate change. Now, the moral and ethical question, I think, is that the people who suffer, by and large, are not the people that cause the problem. So those of us who live in North America or Europe, who have enjoyed the fruits of industrialisation and production of greenhouse gases from that, are not the people who are suffering. The people who are suffering are in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, who actually didn't cause this problem at all. And the next series of slides are quite interesting ones where the people that created them have distorted the country's shape proportionately to whatever it is that I'm showing. So if I show, for instance, production of greenhouse gases in the next one, you can see full well that, you know, it's North America and Europe really that are the main producers of greenhouse gases. Britain in the 19th century was the world's biggest producer of greenhouse gases, so there's more carbon under Britain in their coal than there is now under the whole of Saudi Arabia, where most of the world's petroleum comes from, and we burnt a lot of that. Now, Africa and Asia, you can see a tiny on this. They didn't produce the carbon, but look who's dying from disasters. It's predominantly people in Asia and Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the reason is because of poverty. This is where people living on less than $2 a day live, and I mean it almost matters. It's certainly not North America and Britain. It's again Africa and Asia. And if you're poor, you will suffer from drought or flooding. And this is not strictly relevant. Well, it is related. Mortality of children under 4, of course, is dominant in Africa and Asia. And often it's from waterborne disease, and that is a secondary effect, if you like, of climate change often. Well, that's some of the scientific issues. I just want to briefly go through some theological, ethical issues which will be looked at in more detail by subsequent speakers. And I really want to put it in a framework of creation and then, at the end of time, recreation, new creation. And we're living in that in-between period now. And just 3 points about creation, which are very obvious. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It's also almost so trivial it's not worth saying in one way, but it's very profound because it's completely countercultural to what most people today believe, that we're just the accidental product of forces of nature in some sense. It's completely different from what people believed at the time Genesis was written, that thought humans were just the product of gods who created them to be their slaves, servants, or maybe just the accidental fallout of something going on somewhere else. The biblical view is quite different, that God purposefully created this universe because he chose to, of his own free will. He will still exist, even if the universe ceased to exist. And the New Testament says exactly the same thing. John says through him, that's through Jesus, all things were made. And then, just in case you haven't got the point, he says exactly the same thing the other way around. He says, in fact, nothing has been made without him that has been made. So he says the same thing twice to stress this. Okay, so that's a very obvious point, but it's a point which is completely countercultural to the majority of the people to whom we're trying to reach with the gospel today. Second thing is that God's creation is good. If you read Genesis 1, it's just pretty obvious. Every single day God sat down at the end of it and he saw what he'd done, and it was good, he says. And then at the end of those 6 days, he sits down, he's created humans, he looks at everything he's made, and he says, it was very good. Well, that's a theological message that you can't miss from Genesis. Matter matters to God, if you like. And I think it's one of the things that marks Christianity out as completely different from all the other world's religions. It's got its feet firmly on the ground. We're not to strive to some higher spiritual plane. We're to work within this material world because it matters to God. He said it was very good. And then the third obvious thing is that this whole world will collapse into chaos, if you like, if it wasn't sustained by God moment by moment. That's the view that Scripture gives. For instance, Hebrews 1:3, Jesus sustains all things by his powerful word. Or another example, Colossians 1:16, for by Jesus all things were created, in him all things hold together. So the sort of picture this is giving is of an example I often use as the old-fashioned television sets, not the digital ones, but the old ones where you had a cathode ray tube. If you're watching some play or some BBC reenactment of some costume drama, like as was on last night, you can engage with it and you can cheer with the heroines and boo the villains and so on. But that whole image is only maintained by a continual flow of electrons, and if that stopped, you just get a chaos of dots, of coloured dots, which is meaningless. So that is being sustained by something behind the scene. And this is sort of the picture the Bible gives, that this world is sustained in its understandable, consistent, coherent way by God's hand. There's no reason it should particularly, but he chooses to do that. And, I'm glad about that because it means you can do science, and I love doing science. That the world is understandable at our level. We can understand it. And that can bring great benefit, of course, particularly in the medical field, abolishing smallpox, for example. So it's not this picture that this cartoon gives, God creating the universe by the Big Break theory. This is a sort of deist view. But I guess that this is a view that many people have of Christianity who are not Christians. They think there's some sort of, if they get anywhere near God, they think, well, maybe he just created it and let it go off on its own as it willed, as it wanted to. That nature, in some sense, was running it. Well, as Augustine said many centuries ago, nature is what God does. So you can't sort of say nature is running it. If that means God should run it. Well then, I'm next just going to give 5 brief principles, because I was asked to give general principles, of how we should then interact with this world. If God created it and it's a good world that he created and sustains, how should we interact with it? In the best traditions of sermons, you'll find they all begin with C. So God cares about the world, so we should. For example, he cares not just about humans. Often we think of humans as being at the peak of creation, and in some sense they are. They are very special, as Psalm 8 says. But God also cares about the rest of creation. Here's an example of Psalm 104. The lions roar for their prey. Who do they seek their food from? From God. Or another interesting one from Job 38. Who cuts the channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water a land where no man lives? It says, a desert with no one in it, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass. God loves to make a fruitful world, whether or not it's for the sake of humans. He cares for the whole of his creation. And that's why it's so tragic now, as Paul says in Romans, that the whole of creation is groaning because of a failure of humankind to care for it properly. We'll come to that in just a minute. Christopher Patten put it this way in his Wreath Lectures in 2000. He said, we should live here as though we're intending to stay for good, not just for the weekend. We should care for the world. We shouldn't trash the world. Well, that's one reason to care for the world. The second reason is that actually God commands us to do so. It's pretty straightforward. It's the very first command he gave humankind in Genesis 1:28. God blessed them. There's blessing in doing this. This is speaking to Adam and Eve now. He said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Straightforward commandment to care for the earth. Sometimes this is talked about as stewarding the earth, but in fact it's a bit stronger even than stewarding. It's having dominion over it, ruling over it. So the picture, again, is of caring for the earth because otherwise it won't be fruitful in the way God intended. And I guess any of us that are gardeners know that if you stop caring for your garden, the weeds soon come up and you don't get the flowers or the vegetables that you hope to get. You know, it's work. And it's no mistake, I think, that this command was given in the Garden of Eden. It was an area, a garden, where God had set humans to care for the world. Now, that's not to care. That's not to have dominion over it in a careless way, where we just utilise it for our own benefit. It is to care for it in the way God would care for it. That's the command he gave. So, straightforward command. And the way we should command it, we should care for the world, is in the way that we should care for it because we're made in the image of God. So we should care for it in the way he would care for it. Now, we could spend hours talking about what it means to be made in the image of God. One thing clearly is that we can relate to God in a personal way. So we may be animals in our DNA and everything, but we're animals plus. We're animals plus being made in the image of God. And I'm sure other people will talk about this more later. But it means that we should perhaps care for the world in the same way as Jesus cared for the world when he was here, which is as a shepherd king, if you like, a servant king. Not just a king abusing it for his own power, but actually caring for it as a shepherd, as a servant. Interestingly, at the time Genesis was written, it used to be the case that the rulers of the land used to set up images of themselves around their borders. And that was clearly to say, I rule here. My rules is sustained within this area of my border. So if we're to rule the earth, the Genesis idea is, we should rule it in the same way as God wants it ruled. And if we don't take that task on properly, then the world will not be giving glory to God as he intended it to do. I think that's the thrust of Scripture. Well, third C, we should care for the world because of community, if you like, because of care for neighbour. Jesus said, love your neighbour as yourself. And clearly, if something we're doing, like having a party with a patio burner in the afternoon, is going to affect greenhouse gases and therefore affect the livelihood of people elsewhere in the world, even if we can't see it, that is not caring for our neighbour. And I think this is one of the difficult issues in a way, why people find it so difficult with global climate change, which is that the people affected are, by and large, not us. You know, it might be nicer if it got a bit warmer here, actually. But the people who are dying now, and it's estimated that even in the year 2000, something like 150,000 people a year were dying from the effects of climate change, probably because they were living on the edge already, so they got disease or they got malnutrition, and so they were pushed over the edge. And those people are out of sight and often, I'm afraid, out of mind. And that's the moral issue. And I think one of the powerful things that the church can speak to is that many of us have connections with people in these countries that are affected, these low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and so on, maybe through aid work or maybe through missionary work. And there are groups of Christians in every single patch of Britain. Every parish got groups of Christians. There are Christians all over the world. So I think in a very powerful way we have a powerful possibility to transform the world because of these connections, not just because we're commanded to, not just because we're Christians who believe in a creator God and so we should care for his creation, but because we have this community, this connection with people all over Britain, all over the world. And we know what's happening to them often through aid agencies and so on. So it seems to me that Christians ought to be taking a lead in this. As Margaret Thatcher said, I don't often quote Margaret Thatcher, but she said this in 1980. She was really ahead of her time. We do not hold a freehold on our world, but only a full repairing lease. We have a moral duty to look after our world and to hand it on in good order to future generations. Well, as I said, we're already using burning resources in Europe at 3.5 times the rate that the world can support. And what we've done already will have ongoing effects for the next 100 years. So this care for other people is, I think, a powerful reason to do something now. The fourth reason is covenant, that God has promised humankind that he will care for the world for us. Things like, never again will I curse the ground because of man. This was after the flood. Never again will I destroy all living creatures as I have done, he said. So we're living in a place and an area where God has promised. As long as earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. So we're living in that covenant relationship anyway, so we ought to live it out in reality. Now, the last point, which is the new creation, which Jonathan certainly will talk about more on Wednesday, I think is where we really move away from the secular agenda. Maybe the first three of these, the secular agenda would agree with. Yeah, we should be nice to other people, we should take note of what we do and how it impacts other people. But a very powerful reason for caring for this earth is that God has said there will be a new creation. It is not the end when Jesus comes back. There will be a continuation. And in Scripture there's a sense, as I'm sure Jonathan will pull out, of both continuity and discontinuity. And the sort of sense, for instance, in 2 Peter is that all the dross, all the sin, all the bad things will be swept away, but all the good things, the honour and glory of the nations, will continue on into the new creation. And we'll live in the way that God intended us to live, if you like, in the fullness of living in his creation. So that is a hope for the future, that actually since the kingdom of heaven is here now, as Jesus said, we should start living it out now, because it's what we're going to be doing for all eternity. That's a very good reason to start now. So I think this, as I said at the beginning, this sort of framework of creation was very good. Our relationship with creation has been spoiled by sin. It's a term decreation some people have used. But there will be a new creation where that dross, that sinfulness will be swept away, is a framework in which we can work very well, I think. As Luther said, if I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today, he said. We should start living now as we intend to continue. And I think in our local churches this can be a very powerful witness to the non-Christians around us. If we're not living out the realities of the new kingdom, then why should they listen to us? So those are 5 sort of general principles which I'm sure will be brought out more fully over the next couple of days, and you'll see some in practice tomorrow on that field trip. I think I'll just spend just a few minutes just with some practicalities, and then we'll open it for questions. We'll have a good 20 minutes or so of questions then, which I hope you'll have lots of. Let me just talk about a few practicalities just so we don't just ignore this area of it. Now, you can read often enough in the press of all sorts of things you should and shouldn't do. You shouldn't drive so much, don't drive a big car, don't drive a fuel-intense car, don't drive heavy, get on your bike, go for a walk, switch off electrical appliances, when I defrost the freezers, insulate walls. There's no lack of this, and I think we all know this sort of stuff. But Christianity is not a religion of laws, as Paul says quite clearly, for instance, in Galatians 2:16. It's a religion of grace where we do things because we want to please God. Now, these are all good things to do, which we can do at personal levels, and a lot of the things are good for us. Actually, walking to school with the kids and talking to other mothers and fathers outside the school gates is probably a lot better for you anyway than getting in your car and driving 3/4 of a mile and getting cross and upset with the traffic and cross with the kids in the back. So many of them are good for us anyway. At communal level, I think, is where the church can speak very powerfully. Some groups already do things like car sharing. You know, is your church using green electricity or not? Something that I think people ignore, or they don't realise it's as powerful as it might be, is the pressure that Christian groups can exert on their MPs and so on. These campaigns, which Tear Fund, for instance, is very good at running, I think can be very powerful, because politicians are only elected for 5 years, or 4 years, and they start thinking about getting re-elected after about 2.5 years. This is a long-term global problem, and it's very hard to get them to do something about it in the short term. And we've seen that time and time again in our country and others. But what they do respond to is pressure from populace, because they want to get re-elected. And I'm always very struck, for instance, by that Dunblane massacre. Do you remember that? Within months, the government had banned handguns. There were complaints from people, how will we ever win another Olympic medal, because we can't practice our shooting. And they just said, look, this is such a big issue, we're going to ban them. And, that's one of the things, in a way, it makes me proud to be British, in a way, because they did that. Now, we could do that with carbon, greenhouse gas production, but we haven't. But governments will change if there is pressure from the electorate to do so. And so I think we have much more power than we imagine, actually, in that area. Conventional fossil fuels, this is what we've used so far. Yellow is natural gas, this orangey colour is coal, and the blue colour is oil. Now, I have no expectation that we'll do anything other than, in the next 50 years, burn up all the oil that there is. It's just inconceivable that human nature will prevent that happening. And even if we slow down the rate at which we'll burn it, we'll probably burn it anyway in a decade or two longer. So it will have much the same effect. We've used about half the oil there is, so over this century, we'll probably use up all the rest of it. Gas will probably use most of that as well. The big issue is coal. There is a massive amount of coal. Burning at the rate we do now, we could last for 400 years. And as I said earlier, coal is a really dirty fuel. It produces twice as much greenhouse gas per unit of energy as natural gas does, and it produces an awful lot of soot, which has a very nasty effect as well. So it seems to me that at a national level, we've got to do things like burn coal in power stations, yes, but capture the carbon dioxide and put it underground where it's not going to cause damage. That's called carbon capture and storage. And I think one of the sad things about the big debate that you've seen about this new power station south of London is that it's not being fitted even with the capability of carbon capture and storage. If we fit the capability now, we can actually install it when we've got the technology worked out. Technology is not difficult. And actually Britain could be a leader of this, because we've been sucking oil out of the North Sea for 30 years. There's containers that held the oil, 5,000 metres under the seabed. It's held the oil for 100 million years. So the possibility exists to pump carbon dioxide back underground through the same pipes. You just pump it back the other way. We could do that. It is being done in some places, but we're not doing it. But if we don't get on and do it in the next decade or so, the pipes will literally go rusty and be unusable. So that's one issue. There are issues about converting this cartoon. This is conversion of food products to petroleum substitutes, conversion of petroleum products to food substitutes. We burn 100 times as much energy at the moment in industrial agriculture as we get from it in calories. Hunter-gatherers used to expend about a tenth of the energy they got back. Agriculture by manually during Victorian ages, it was about 1-to-1. Now we rely on fossil fuels for industrial agriculture. And nowadays there's such pressure to keep our cars going that, as you know, people are converting soybeans and stuff to petroleum substitutes. And part of the increase of food prices so rapidly last year has been ascribed to the pressure to make petroleum substitutes from growing things. So national things we can do things about. I won't talk in detail about that. I've talked about carbon capture and storage. Other countries are doing it. This is just 2 holiday snaps from recently. Austria is very good at burning waste to make energy locally. If you're interested in the nitty-gritties of this is a great book that's just come out by a professor in the Cavendish Physics Laboratory here, and you can download the whole book from the web for free. It's got all the numbers of sustainable energy. This is one of the pictures from his book. I love this cartoon. Okay, it's agreed, they're saying. We announce to do nothing is not an option. Then we wait and see how things pan out. But his conclusion is that actually you need a massive amount of renewable. Britain is not the greatest place for solar energy, really. It's just too grey. So we probably need a mix of nuclear power and other sources. We can save a lot of energy just by insulation, double glazing, more fuel-efficient cars, getting on your bike, that sort of thing. The key is, of course, international, and that's always the hard place to be, because everybody says, I'm not going to do anything about it until you do. That's China says they're not going to do anything about it until North America does. But again, the moral issue is that here's the USA's production of carbon per person, and here's Europe's, which is nearly as bad. These are the low-income countries. And if we're going to share the resources properly, which seems to be the only just thing to do, we need to get down to about 1 tonne of carbon per person, this blue line. We are miles off doing that. But the only just thing is that these countries are allowed to increase their production. And we should decrease ours, so that we share resources equally. Okay, so that's just a quick sort of run through some practical stuff. I'm sure there's lots of other things that people have in mind. So I will stop there, and we've got 20 minutes for questions now. So why don't I hand over to Rodney for that?
Thank you very much, Bob. Questions from the floor, please. Surely not stunned into silence.
You haven't said anything about world economy or how economy functions, and it seems to me actually the two are very closely linked, especially when you have, for instance, the response to the recent economic crisis isn't use less and be more economical, but it's how can we get people spending more and consuming more. It seems that the two are incredibly closely tied.
I agree with you, and it's remarkable, isn't it? We've just seen the failure of free market economics, which is thinly disguised greed, as far as I can tell. And what a disaster it's been, and what a disaster it always is for the people at the bottom of the pile, as all these things are. They're the ones that suffer. The net flow of money has been, over the last 3 decades, from the poor to the rich. Even now, it's the poor countries that are feeding wealth to the rich. We offshore our making our clothes, and we send our waste to China and so on. And I think it's a remarkable blindness by our population at large, by the people that govern us, to think that more of the same is going to solve the problem. I don't know how you answer that. I mean, Christianity has an answer because it's countercultural, but the thing I so often hear from people who deny climate change are actually also coming from right-wing think tanks saying, the way to improve the lot of the poor is to increase the wealth of everybody, then as a trickle down to everybody all the way down. But it just doesn't work. I mean, we've seen that it doesn't work. And I think this economic slump at the moment is proving that. So maybe that's, in some ways it's a good thing, because people are seeing the failure of raw materialism. But how you change the economic system, I mean, one way I think that you can do it within a framework which will also help the greenhouse gas problem is if you actually costed the cost of the carbon that you're producing at source, right? So probably the damage we're doing from every tonne of carbon is about £100 per tonne. if you use that for adaptation and mitigation, then that would be about the right value. So actually, if at the moment we allow oil companies and so on to just pull these resources out of the ground for free, right, and then we sell it, and the oil companies say it's not our problem, it's the consumer that makes the greenhouse gas, and they strive to be neutral in their carbon. These amazing adverts by BP, beyond petroleum, we're greener than green can be, and yet they're producing the petroleum. Now, if you actually costed the cost of the damage you're doing, so you add £100 per tonne of petroleum, for instance, and then follow that through to the consumer, so the consumer pays all the way through, it would end up being cost neutral in a way, because this is just money in circulation. But then you can use that money to pay for mitigation or for adaptation, and I think that's one of the possibilities. But to make it work, it has to be a global agreement, and this is the whole problem with Kyoto Agreement, for instance, which started. Well, Kyoto worked on a different way. They tried a cap and trade system. But if you actually put the value right at the beginning, it just carries, and the capitalist system will still work fine, all the sales and so on, it just carries along with it all the way. And I think that's the real issue, that we're using a resource and not paying for it. And that might help to solve the problem just by the normal capitalist system. We wouldn't have to change anything. But everybody has to agree to do it. That's the issue.
More questions? Yeah.
Clearly the planet's suffering from a plague of human beings, but what would you say a sustainable global population of humans would be in an ideal world?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I've looked into that a bit for another thing I'm writing, and it always ends up as people thinking, well, it's a bit less than it is now. But so there were 100 different studies which varied from 3 billion to 300 billion. The average was about 7 billion, so just a bit more than it is now from all those. It's sort of how long is a piece of string, but I think a better approach is to say we should have some just way of sharing resources. How do we want to live now? I mean, one of the shocking things about food is the statistic, for instance, that there are 850 million people suffering from malnutrition in the world today. There's about 1,000 billion obese people whose health is ruined by being too fat today. And there's a failure of justice here somewhere, isn't there? There is enough food to make people fat, and food in Britain is cheaper than it has ever been in the history of humankind. I think we spend 6% of our income on food. If you go back a few hundred years, people spent their whole effort getting enough to eat, basically. So we've got things out of kilter, I think, somehow, and that's one of the big issues. I think that. So, to go back to the population issue, I think you can't really tell somebody you mustn't have all the regimes that have tried to forcibly stop people having children haven't worked. But what does bring population to a stable level is empowerment of women, education, provision of health care, so you don't need to have 13 children because 10 of them might die, and a standard of living that means you're actually living above the poverty line. Now, I think many studies have shown that too much wealth is actually makes you less happy, but there is obviously a level where you need enough to live, proper, decent lives. Beyond that, more can be worse. So I think those three, and there's enough resources in the world to do that with our present population, if it was distributed equitably. That's the issue. But education and healthcare are things that I think, everybody in this room would say, yes, we should have better healthcare and education for people in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the problem will sort of solve itself.
Wealth tends to reduce family size.
Yes.
in quite a major way.
Yes.
And sustainably, Italy, as I understand it, is the population is declining quite fast. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Britain is actually, the indigenous population of Britain is below replacement level now. We don't have enough children to replace ourselves. But there is immigration which keeps it increasing at the moment. So I think good healthcare, good education, and a reasonable standard of living, then we'll come to a stable population. That's what people think at the moment will happen at about double the present population. But I think probably double the present population is a bit too much problem for everybody to have a good standard of living. It's a matter of opinion.
Yes.
You mentioned it briefly with Luther's reference to planting trees, but it's a real concern to me, deforestation, and what difference would it make if every nation actually increased the number of forests?
Yes. Planting trees absorbs carbon from the atmosphere because it grows. It's only a short-term solution, but it might be what we need to get us through the next 100 years. Because, of course, trees after 30 years, then they die and they rot, and the carbon is released to the atmosphere again. And it's particularly bad if it rots in a swamp and beavers get to work on it and make a lot of methane, because then it's actually worse than the carbon, it's carbon dioxide. But clearly deforestation is not a good thing at a huge level, and it would be good to stabilise that. Planting trees is not a bad thing either, but it's not the whole solution. I think it's a temporary, it might be a temporary solution that can help us.
Thank you. Yes.
Excuse me for my voice. Even if all the conditions with the education and living are equal everywhere, because of the climate change, some areas on Earth will be worse and worse for living, just in climate terms. It means that there will be a huge influx, as you mentioned, of migration, of climate migration, not even economical.
Yeah.
Taking into account all the issues, including Christian point of view, shouldn't be just allow it everywhere without any restriction, just allow all the people to migrate to save their life from climate disasters, or it should be regulated, or what is the scenario for future migration from your point of view?
Well, I think it's a big issue, and of course the Old Testament has a lot to say about caring for the stranger in your midst. And I guess, again, as Christians here, we ought to be taking the lead in caring for refugees, and I know many churches do, and they fight for the legal rights of refugees and so on, and they give aid to refugees, and they try and prevent the necessity to become refugees in the first place by, developing drought-resistant crops, teaching people better ways of micro-farming that can help them to sustain, a lifestyle in a changing climate. And all those things are good things to do. But as I said, I agree with you that I think it's going to be a big presenting issue, particularly to us in Britain. What are we going to do if there's an influx of refugees? Are we going to welcome them, or are we going to band together as a tribe and try and keep them out?
There will be issues. On the other side, people will want to raise about the sheer capacity of this country in terms of more people.
We are very dense. The other side of the coin is that a lot of things that keep this country going are done by not refugees, but by people who have come in from lower income countries at the moment. So in a way, we're benefiting from it at the moment anyway. And I think that's generally true, actually, of refugees in most countries. If they're allowed to work, that actually they benefit the country they've gone to.
But how to define the terms, how to regulate this?
Yeah.
Because, for instance, in Malta, this year, every day, about 100 people arrived just swimming from Africa.
Yes.
And they don't have jobs.
Yes, indeed. No, I think it is going to be a big presenting issue for us over the next few decades, and how to deal with it.
The back, yeah.
Just two quick questions, if I may. Firstly, you showed one of the images about the ice core. The carbon dioxide varied with the temperature way back in time. Just wondered if you could comment on where there was no industrial influences, what caused the carbon dioxide to increase many years ago.
Right, well, in this case it was driven in the other direction, so it was driven by temperature changes, right? So the ice ages are caused by the sun gets a little bit further away, for example, and conditions change a bit, so you get an ice age. But so the driving factor in that case is the temperature, but there are feedbacks between when it gets colder, things don't grow so well, and so you don't absorb so much carbon dioxide or whatever. You know, there are quite complicated feedbacks that cause this coupling. And in fact, I think in those cases, people have shown that in the ice ages, the carbon dioxide lags the temperature change by about 40 years. So they are coupled feedbacks, but the same works the other way. If you increase the carbon dioxide, then we know that's greenhouse gas, so you'll increase the temperature.
Is there any evidence to say that as the greenhouse, as the CO2 increases, that will actually have a sort of increasing effect on the temperature? They'll interact so that the rate will increase.
Yeah, that's called positive feedback, yes, and there are some scary ideas that is the case. And these graphs I've shown have not put those feedbacks in because they've done the most conservative estimate they can. And one you might have heard about, for instance, is as temperature increases in the northern hemisphere, then you get more melting of the ice caps, and the water drains through crevasses to the bottom, and then it lubricates the bottom because you've got a layer of warm water. And then the ice is flowing now, it seems the outflow glaciers are flowing 3 or 4 times faster than they used to. And so that accelerates the melting, which itself accelerates the temperature because ice reflects light, and if you've got open water, you absorb temperature. So the Arctic, the temperature in the Arctic is going up much faster than the rest of the world. It's gone up 3 or 4 degrees, and that's why 20% of the Arctic ice cap has melted, and it may have disappeared by 2030 or something like that. So there are feedbacks, that's one of them. Another scary feedback, actually, is that as temperature gets higher, the oceans are getting more acidic, and most of the carbon dioxide is taken up in the oceans one way and another, and in soils, and it may be organisms can't live so well, so it will not be able to take up carbon dioxide so well. And this is James Lovelock's worry, that there's a tipping point beyond which it runs away. Now, I think most scientists would think we haven't quite reached that tipping point. Lovelock thinks we have. But, you know, there is one there, and it is a complex system, and the sort of precautionary principle would say, well, you know, let's take care about this anyway, because of what might happen. And there was an interesting report last year, or 2007, called the Stern Report. Stern is an economist, and he just looked at the impact of climate change on the likely economy. No moral imperative, no Christian input, nothing except the straight economics. And he said it's worth investing 1% in climate change issues now, because we'll save 20% down the line in two or 3 decades' time, just on a straight economic argument. You know, things like the price of oil is going up, as we saw, although it's gone down again now. So it's worth paying some money to insulate the roof because you'll burn less fuel keeping yourself warm. That's a good investment, you know, and that is a good investment. Actually, the payback is only a matter of 5 years or so. But there's other things you can do that have different payback terms. So, yeah, so it is worth doing some. Both, it is real and it's likely to happen. We don't understand all the feedbacks, and every feedback we haven't included tends to make it worse, actually. But it is worth doing something about it on a straight economic basis, actually.
Thank you. Yes.
You talked about the melting of the glaciers and the likelihood that in the northern hemisphere it will get increasingly colder. Is there evidence that the other climate zones that we have will sink south too, and that actually we'll see migration of Western culture almost having to move further south? Is there evidence that that will happen?
Right. No, getting colder in Britain was just one unique thing if you switched off the Gulf Stream.
Yeah.
By and large, the zones move northwards, actually, so we'll be able to grow wheat. We won't. They will be able to grow wheat in Siberia, for instance, which is a good thing, in a way. It is a very complex system, and I don't want to say we understand it better than we do, but most predictions are that it'll be mid-latitudes, so that's sort of 30 to 50, our sort of latitude, will get more extreme weather, so more droughts that last longer, maybe last 2 or 3 years, which is pretty disastrous if you're a subsistence farmer, or more floods and storms, which are maybe not more of them, but more intense. You know, in a more intense storm, even in the most technologically advanced nation in the world, as we saw with Katrina, you know, killed dozens of people. So think what that does in somewhere that's less technically advanced. So I think that the main worry is not so much the overall increase as the increase in extremes, and they'll be mostly mid-latitudes, so sub-Saharan Africa will suffer, as if it doesn't suffer enough already, and mid-latitudes. are as good a prediction as you can get.
We've got time for one more, perhaps, for coffee. Yes.
I was thinking that there's a sort of air of inevitability about a lot of this, and which creates a kind of feeling of a certain degree of helplessness.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, it isn't exactly a question, but I was wondering why in part the sort of general population, i.e. me and everyone else, are sort of protected from some of the more startling predictions that there could be. And surely a communication system that actually informs the general public better would be of great help at the moment, even if we couldn't do very much, that people could actually start making decisions which actually would begin to change things.
Yeah.
Possibly, even if it didn't change things.
Yeah. No, thank you for that comment, and I'm sorry, I should have stressed more, these last 2 points, that there is Christian hope for the future, and Christians of all people ought to be the ones that are injecting a hopeful view. Look at a changed lifestyle. This is good, and Christ offers hope for the future in all sorts of areas of our life, but this is one of them. So thank you for a reminder of that. The other issue is just straight education, I think. I talk to so many people in North America particularly. I think Britain is getting pretty good, actually, that people do know. North America, they really don't. But I sometimes tell this story, so I'll tell it again. I was sitting at a dinner next to a Nobel Prize winner from Cambridge, a physicist who was used to numbers and calculations and things, and had discovered something very amazing. I won't say who it was, so Rodney knows. And he's a terribly nice man, and he's a Christian, actually. And I was sitting next to him talking about some of these issues, about low-energy light bulbs, in this case. And I said, look, one of the simplest things you do is just change your light bulb for a low-energy one, and it will save you money as well. And he said to me, I mean, he can do calculations, he knows these things. He said, well, I went down to Sainsbury's the other day, and a normal light bulb was 50p, and the low-energy one was £3.50, so of course I bought the cheap one, because I wanted to save money. So then, I don't normally do this at dinner, but because he was a physicist, I thought, well, I will. I said, well, let's say it's a 100-watt light bulb, and it's on in your porch, and you leave it on through the night, through the year, so that's an average of 10 hours a night, summer and winter. So that's 1 kilowatt hour, so that's 1 unit a day, so it's an easy calculation to do. 10p a unit, so that's £36 a year you're spending on that. You buy a low-energy light bulb, it uses a fifth the energy. So although it costs £3.50 instead of £3, you recoup that £3 in about 2 months. And then it's cheaper thereafter, and the low-energy light bulb lasts 4 or 5 times longer anyway, so you haven't got to keep buying them. And he said, yeah, you're right, I'd never thought about that. It's not amazing. He's a Nobel Prize winner. And I think that's generally true, actually. I think people don't realise that a lot of these things you can get people to do are in their own self-interest. Low-energy light bulbs will save you money on your electricity bill. So I personally think that it's quite hard for Christians can't really preach the sort of ethical view to those around them. Well, they might mention it, but it's not a way to get people to do things. But their own economic self-interest probably is. And a lot of these things, as I say, walking to school is probably healthier and better for you than driving if it's only half a mile or whatever. Low-energy light bulbs, putting insulation in will save you money, so why don't you do it? So I think that's one tack we can take. But as I say, all of you are going to be working in local churches, and hopefully your churches will be full of atheists and people who don't know the gospel. At least that's what I hope, because the church is meant to be, it's meant to be an outreach group to bring people in and tell them the gospel. And this is one place we might connect with people, because a lot of people in Britain are aware of this, and if they see the church couldn't care less about it, then they're going to be turned off. So I think at the very least we ought to be being careful about how we behave as churches. And I guess you'll hear a lot more about this over the next couple of days.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Bob. That's a great...